I'm Marc Sidwell, and my guest today is Daniel Freeman, Managing Editor at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Oil prices are poised to climb after US strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities raise the risk of retaliation, potentially targeting regional energy assets or disrupting shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Markets will be watching closely this week to see how Tehran responds, but if events spiral, a rise in crude is on the cards, adding fresh pressure to the British economy at an already delicate moment. Daniel, how bad do you think these risks are, and what can Britain do to prepare?
The risk of increasing oil prices is real, but we probably shouldn't catastrophize too much. So currently the price of a barrel of oil is, despite the war breaking out between Israel and Iran, is still slightly under $80 a barrel. And to put that into perspective, that is slightly lower than the price of oil this time last year, and much lower than its peak after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when it got up to $130 a barrel. That said, as you mentioned, this threat by some inside Iran, and the suggestion that the Iranians may attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz, probably, if it were to happen, probably would have an effect on oil prices, in large part because about a fifth of the world's oil exports go through this strait that runs between sort of the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Iran. Now, the question is, there are a few questions. First of all, will Iran attempt to do this? Now, obviously, the Iranian regime is going to want to react in some way to the recent American bombing of their
I think, just to jump in there, the latest I've heard is that the Parliament has voted to say that they will try and close the strait, or they will close the strait. But of course, that is to some extent like something for the media, because the actual decision, because it's Iran and it's not really a democracy, is going to be taken by the Supreme Council. So we're waiting to see how that goes. Sorry, I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right to point this out. So yes, the Iranian Parliament did vote for this, but this is not at all binding on the Supreme National Security Council, who will ultimately make this decision. And there are several risks if Iran is to go down this route. One is that the vast majority of Iran's oil is exported through the Strait of Hormuz. So if you turn this region into a war zone, well, that has an impact on your exports. And also, there's a risk that it alienates the other countries in the region, so Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and also you're likely to really irritate, say, China, which a very substantial portion of the oil exported through the Persian Gulf and through the Strait of Hormuz ends up in China. A very, very small percentage of it goes to, say, the US or Europe. And on top of that, on top of the risk of alienating China, who the Iranians have interest in keeping at least fairly neutral in this confrontation, there's also the risk that this ends with you getting into naval confrontations with, say, the United States, or with Britain, or with other European powers who will want to keep this waterway open.
Yes. So the thing is, I suppose, the American strike on Iran's nuclear facilities has in some ways really shown that the unlikely can happen. That it was something that was talked about for many decades. There was a real feeling, even in the days before, that Trump wasn't actually going to push the button on this. And markets have been quite sanguine, I suppose rightly so, because it seems unlikely that these big world-changing events are going to happen. But then the fact that Trump actually did authorise these strikes shows that we might perhaps be in a world where these sort of edge cases, these things that we think, well, on balance, probably everyone's not going to really go that far, could still happen. So there is certainly at least the possibility of events spiralling out of control, even though one can hope for the best, and the markets for the moment seem to be relatively calm about it. Would you say that's right?
On some level, yes. So I think it's absolutely true that Donald Trump being in the White House adds an element of uncertainty to not just this conflict, but to conflicts all over the world, and global trade and economic policy. We've seen this with various announcements on tariffs, which seem to be heading in one direction and then be countermanded and then go back and forwards. And so, yeah, this absolutely does add an element of uncertainty. But I think there is also a risk of overstating the scale of these strikes. Like you get some commentators acting as if, well, this absolutely means that the US is going to get into a prolonged confrontation with Iran. But I think people in the Trump administration were quite keen to sort of draw a line under these strikes. So, you've got these strikes on 3 nuclear enrichment facilities. But so far, you haven't seen sort of the US taking part in the sort of level of strikes that Israel has been doing. So
yes, and certainly, Trump is very much elected through the sort of the MAGA coalition as someone who wasn't going to cause more wars. So even though he has very strong views on Iran having a nuclear weapon and felt the need to act in this case, there certainly are countervailing forces within his own base who are saying, no, we don't want more wars.
Yeah, even on the more kind of hawkish side of the Trump administration, people like Marco Rubio, who have been seen as a more traditional sort of Republican hawk on issues like Iran and also Russia. Marco Rubio issued a statement yesterday saying that the US did not have any plans for further strikes on Iran unless Iran retaliates against, say, US bases in the Middle East. So I think at this stage there's a desire to not get sucked too far into this. Now, it's perfectly possible that, depending on how the Iranian government reacts, this may still happen. But I think the US administration is quite cognizant of the risks involved in this.
Well, we must hope for the best and hope that the stability that the markets seem to be predicting manages to hold on despite these complicated events. The government has unveiled plans to slash green levies on thousands of British firms to bring down their energy costs. It's the centrepiece of a long-awaited industrial strategy focused on 8 key sectors from clean energy to life sciences and advanced manufacturing. Is this the push Britain needs to reignite growth? Now, Daniel, you and I are both fairly sceptical, I think, about industrial strategies and this sort of approach as a way to, to sort out the UK economy, but it's certainly the sort of ideological approach that Labour and Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have very much prided themselves on and put at the centre of their way of thinking about things. And it's also clear that there are huge problems with industrial energy costs in the UK. They're the highest in the developed world. They've been causing firms to shut, to move overseas. It was something that really needed looking at. Do you think this is going to do any good at all, or is this a sign that they're creating further problems and they should have done something else that would have been a better way to approach this challenge?
Taking these policies overall, so you've got the £275 million that has been pledged towards increasing educational programs and apprenticeships for manufacturing. And you've also got this tax reduction when it comes to electricity costs for some energy-intensive manufacturers. There's talk about this applying to about 7,000 manufacturers, up from there's currently a scheme that applies to very electricity intensive industries but it only currently applies to about 500 businesses. So this is an extension of that. I think it is indicative of the government's broader policy, which is basically to put more burdens of one form or another onto business, onto the private sector as a whole, in terms of taxation. So you've seen this with employer national insurance contributions going up. That has a big effect on the cost of hiring people, but also in terms of a lot of social and environmental policy, which is, again, in some ways not too dissimilar from some of the things that previous Conservative governments have been doing, which is to say, well, we don't really want to spend money, we don't want the Treasury to spend money on X or Y, so we're going to basically require businesses to do that and fine them if they don't. But then, in addition to that, what the current government seems to be doing is then applying sort of specific subsidies and support to industries that it wants to keep afloat. And I think you can see the political calculus behind this, that industries that are very energy intensive have really been struggling in the UK over especially the last 10 years, as industrial energy prices have increased dramatically. And as you rightly say, we have just about the most expensive industrial electricity in the world. But the problem is there doesn't really seem to be very much effort to deal with the underlying causes of this. So the approach is to just accept that overall costs are going to go up for business, but then throw a life belt into the water.
Yeah, and we should add here, of course, that the government is not an innocent party in why those prices have gone up. A lot of this is very much to do with other government policies, particularly around net zero, green levies, renewable levies, things like that, which are part of the government's attempt to deal with the energy transition, but have definitely inflated costs, and also the perhaps more significantly in a way. A lack of abundance thinking about energy, an unwillingness to commit to, much greater capacity for electricity generation and particularly nuclear, which of course would be another way around the dilemmas of net zero and the climate transition. So is this a sign that government is just going to continue to throw in new subsidies at the side to help these businesses perhaps push more costs onto the consumers and not really change its underlying approach at all? So this may look like something new, but this is really just about keeping the status quo going?
I think probably yes. I mean, as you point out by saying it's the status quo, this is not an approach, unfortunately, that is entirely new to this government. I mean, both Conservative coalition and Labour governments over the last 20 years have presided over industrial electricity prices that have roughly tripled in real terms. So accounting for inflation, and this is very much not something that was inevitable. So if you compare us to other industrial economies, so say the US, if you go back to the early 2000s, British and US electricity prices were roughly the same. Now our prices are about 3 times higher than the US, and they're also much higher than countries like France, for example, which
Has a lot of
is an
nuclear.
example. Yeah, is an example of a country that has built extensive amounts of nuclear power and has significantly lower energy prices than us. And even with these tax breaks and subsidies that the government is applying to certain parts of the manufacturing sector, they're talking about reducing uh, electricity costs by up to 25%. Now, British industrial electricity is still about, I think, 40% higher than French and German electricity. So we will even in those industries where they get these tax breaks, you will still have some of the most expensive energy in the world. And when you combine that with being in a relatively high wage country, having all sorts of issues when it comes to planning and other environmental regulation, it's quite hard to see how energy intensive industries can compete with competition from abroad.
Do you think, just sort of thinking at a slightly higher level about this, that the problem here is Labour's mindset, its approach to the whole thing? Because they very much came in, I was alluding to this earlier, with this mission-directed state, this sort of Mariano Mazzucato way of thinking, where you use strong government action to set strategies and to lead people out of these problems and to get growth through big government control. And it doesn't look like that's going to work, but that's certainly the direction they're committed to. So do they simply have the wrong ideas about how you sort these sorts of problems out?
Um, in my view, yes. Like I think so. Even if you do believe there should be a bigger role for the state, or even just continuing the existing level of state involvement, I think there is a very strong case that you ought to try and do it in a neutral way. So part of the problem with industrial policy over the last, well, forever, basically, and actually in the vast majority of Western countries, is it often political objectives often take priority. So you get significant bailouts to particular industries that perhaps are concentrated into a small area, and so there's a lot of political pressure in order to keep those going. And then other industries that may where Britain may have more of a comparative advantage tend to get ignored or get hammered more and more. Um, and this ultimately just leads to, well, what we've had over the last 20 years, which is across the board pretty general stagnation and specific targeted policies that don't really go anywhere.
On that downbeat note, let's move on to our final topic for this discussion. Finally, today, the Bank of England's decision to hold interest rates steady at 4.25% came as no surprise, but it still frustrated many who were hoping for a cut. With unemployment ticking up, growth softening, and inflation cooling, the case for action seemed clear. As economist Damien Pudner argued in CapX, Labour's tax-heavy budget and rising public spending are draining confidence, with fiscal policy now appearing to fuel the downturn rather than cushion it. Now, Daniel, at the IEA, you have a shadow MPC, of course, that studies the Bank of England's decisions quite closely and has its own views on what should have been done. What's your take on the Bank of England's decision?
I have read Damien Pudner's work, which you highlighted in. He was recently in CapX, and as is mentioned in the article, he also published a paper for the IEA a few months ago, and I think Damien's argument, and the argument of quite a few people on the Shadow Monetary Policy Committee, is that the Bank of England now is in some ways overcompensating for mistakes, the mistakes that it made in uh, in 2021 and into 2022, where during the late stages of COVID, throughout COVID, there was massively expansionary fiscal policy and extremely loose monetary policy. And the assumption by the Bank of England and many other central banks was that this is okay. Any inflation as we leave lockdown will be temporary. It won't persist. And so they basically had far too loose monetary policy. Then you get the war in Ukraine, which pushes up energy prices, and you get a spiral of inflation that causes,
and with very real political consequences, of course. I mean, certainly the Conservatives really suffered from that, and we saw governments around the world falling, at least in significant part because voters really hate inflation. It's something that they feel very directly when they see all the prices going up. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you look at Trump in the US. This clearly, as I was talking about global things, this isn't just a UK phenomenon. People have thought for a long time that it's a very good thing to keep these central banks independent of government, so they're not sort of too swayed by these political decisions. But when they start to have political consequences, when they get things wrong, it's harder and harder to keep the two apart. I mean, and in the US, you see Trump constantly having a go at Jerome Powell at the Fed, trying to get him to cut rates. Do you think we're going to see Labour and the bank butting heads, or is Keir Starmer too much of a cool head? He likes things sort of kept the way they are, so he's not too likely to pick a fight in the same Trumpian style.
My guess would be he is very much a sort of pro-institutions guy. That's his sort of pitch. So I would be very surprised if you get anything public from, say, Keir Starmer or Rachel Reeves sort of haranguing. They're certainly not going to start haranguing the Monetary Policy Committee in the same way that Trump has been laying into people at the Fed. But that said, behind the scenes, you may well get sort of memos being passed backwards and forwards, and sort of the sense that it would, I think the vast majority of economists agree that ultimately interest rates do need to come down, and there are many people in the Monetary Policy Committee who have voted for that even this time round. The question is just the pace at which this happens. And I think, bearing in mind that inflation is still somewhat above the 2% target, I think the Bank of England is going to be reluctant to cut rates too fast until inflation has come down a bit more.
As in energy and other things, there's a fragility in the UK economy and a real urgency and a need for growth, but quite often it seems that the institutions and the policies that are being put forward just aren't quite of the order and reflecting that urgency in what we see. Daniel Freeman, thank you so much. It's been a really interesting conversation. Make sure you're subscribed to our daily email briefings. Go to capx.co, that's capx.co. I'm Marc Sidwell. Goodbye.